Yeah, it
All
goes.
right, welcome everyone to another episode of the Freight Caviar podcast. This is part of the Big Fish of Freight podcast, and I'm really happy to have Craig Fuller, the CEO and founder of FreightWaves and the owner of Flying Magazine, on the show today. Craig, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show today.
I'm excited to be here. I'm a big fan of what Freight, what you're building at Freight Caviar. It's punchy and it's provocative, and that's what the industry needs.
Well, thanks, Craig. I appreciate that. I'm a big fan of FreightWaves and what you've done. So I think we're going to have an exciting conversation. And I think what I really want to know is the development of Craig Fuller. Could you tell us your background, how you got into logistics? And then afterwards, I'm going to start asking you questions about FreightWaves. But if for now, you just get, the background.
So I grew up in trucking. My dad started a large trucking company, U.S. Express. And before that, my uncle, my grandfather had started a trucking company. He was one of the sort of patriarchs of long haul trucking. And so trucking's literally been a part of my life the entire time. My uncle started Covenant, so I sort of come from the big trucking world. But these were businesses in 1985, I was 6 years old, that were effectively bootstrapped. And my dad and my uncle both started their businesses. And I saw how they, I was old enough to where I got to see the journey really in the earliest days when they were in literally a 2x2 double wide trailer was the offices, all the way to what they are today. So that was my whole life, was defined seeing these businesses. And so I got to learn the business through the eyes of my dad, but also got to see it through the eyes of a child and through a teenager and a college student, sort of absorbing how these businesses are built. And so I got to sort of experience the front lines of when trucking was really a boom market, particularly that long haul market. And it was right after deregulation. So I got to just had a front row seat to it. And I've always loved it. I've always been a freight nerd. I've always loved how the market works. I love the players, I love the people, I love the stories. So in many ways, I was sort of born to do this. And then I've had a couple of businesses outside of freight. And 2016, I was bored. Didn't know what I wanted to do next. And I was just sitting on the sidelines doing some day trading unsuccessfully. And CNBC kept talking about the global ocean market as a sort of a barometer of the global commodities and global economy. And yet they never mentioned trucking as that sort of barometer. And I realized there was no data or information in the market to actually provide intelligence about what's happening in freight on a real-time basis. So that's what we set out to build at FreightWaves.
So when you realized that you wanted to build Sonar was what you wanted to, with the data you wanted to build. And I actually listened to your podcast with Nathan Laka, where you talk about how you wanted to market Sonar, but it was like very expensive, and it was like $30,000-$40,000 a month to market it. And then you set out to start the media piece. Is that how it went?
Yeah. So the original idea behind FreightWaves was to build a futures market, basically a tradable instrument based on trucking. That was before the media business and Sonar came along. And we set out to do that. And I learned a lot about how financial markets are built. And financial markets really have a couple of things going for them. But the common things are that there's typically to build these successful markets is a real-time news business and sort of telling people what's going on in the commodities. And you see this in the oil markets, and you see it in other commodity markets where there's a lot of information. CNBC and Bloomberg and Reuters are putting out a lot of information about the markets what's going on. And then you get these sites like Benzinga and others that also provide sort of real-time information. Seen it in crypto as well. There's stuff in cannabis. Yeah. So if you're trading things, there's a lot of information, but no one really treated trucking as a tradable market or a volatile market. And I remember it was an editor at one of the world's largest premier media businesses that has a logistics and supply chain coverage. And the editor said that he didn't believe that trucking was that volatile. That was sort of the statement he made back in 2016 when I started it. And I realized that there was a big disconnect in the market of not having information. But we didn't start out to be a media company. We actually went out and created the data product to enhance thinking that if real-time data was available, that people were more likely to trade futures. So that's how Sonar really came about, was trying to drive information intelligence that people could use to trade trucking futures. Well, the trucking futures business thing never really worked out. Even though we launched it, it never really got going. But Sonar did become a way for people to understand in a near real-time basis what's happening in freight, provide very early indicators. So that's how we created Sonar. But one of the big issues we had was a lot of the incumbent media businesses that were in freight, that names that are still around, just didn't understand that freight was a volatile market. The trucking was very volatile, and didn't understand freight as the idea that this is a marketplace and that there's an entire sort of a business of moving freight, and the market's incredibly volatile. And so because of that, no one was treating the media cycle around freight on a near daily or real-time basis. And so these news stories would break, and you would see it a week later in Transport Topics, or a couple months later in the Journal of Commerce. And that just became pretty absurd to me. Someone who grew up in sort of media happening on a real-time basis, is the fact that why would a story take months? And so we set out to build FreightWaves to sort of solve for that. And how we got there was we wanted media presence of Sonar. We wanted basically the freight media to cover our product, Sonar. And what I found is they may do a story, but it may take months for them to publish it, or they didn't understand it at all. So we realized that really had to build our media business to sort of serve our data product. And then we discovered that there was a lot of desire for real-time information that went beyond just our products.
Okay. And then, so Craig, when you had this idea for Sonar and FreightWaves, what was like the first step that you took? Because I know you raised money. Could you tell us like about the process of like from the idea to, actually making it a company, how it looked like?
So I remember I was working for I'm trying to remember what they did. It really wasn't a great career. So it was like employee engagement. And I just met my wife, and I told her I wanted to quit my job. And as a founder, and this has probably happened for you and other founders, is you just get this sort of like, I don't know, this feeling that you're onto something and you just can't stop it. And I think a lot of founders do. You sort of get these ideas and you have them for a couple of days, and then you sort of become disenchanted with it. There was something about this that I just kept going. And I remember I went home and I told my now wife, who we were just dating, only knew each other for a couple of months, that I wanted to quit my job and start this business. And she's like, I just met you. Like, I'm leaving New York City to I lived in Texas at the time, moved to Texas. What are you talking about? Like, what are we going to do? I'm quitting my job in the city. And just became this thing. And I'm like, I'm doing it. And so she said, well, hold off. And so 2 days later, I was like, yeah, I quit my job. I turned in my notice. I'm doing it. Like, burn your bridge, burn your ships and burn the bridges and go. And I did. And I called up a couple of friends and said, hey, I need to raise money. And, raising money is no different than any other sales thing you do. Is it just, you literally are networking and asking for introductions. And there's no science to it. It's just, there's no like art to it, in the sense that it is literally a numbers game. And you pitch enough people like you would a product, and eventually, hopefully you'll find somebody that likes your idea, or at least likes you enough to help you shape the idea. And that's what happened. So we were fortunate to find a high net worth individual in Texas that within like 60 days of starting the business wrote us a check. It was a loan. It was a $2 million loan. They now have been paid back 100%, and they got 25% of the business, which, $2 million to write a check for a PowerPoint presentation seems like a really good deal. And at the time it felt that way. Now it feels like a very expensive deal, because I know how much ownership they have the company, and they've gotten all their money back. So, but we just went out and networked it and raised money, and that set us on our way. And, the business took a while to sort of figure out what we wanted to do. We tried a number of things. We actually had a freight brokerage at one point.
Really?
That
FreightWaves was a freight brokerage?
It's called Now Freight.
Okay.
It was a small freight broker that we did in the earliest days. And
What with that?
We sold it off. We shut it down. It never really made money. It was,
Okay.
and so we showed that off. I mean, I think we were in it for like 4 months. In the early days of starting a business, you do a lot of things. You're like, oh,
Sure.
we're going to do all these things. And you start chasing all these things. And eventually you're like, okay, I need to figure out what's actually going to work. And so to get media, sort of the earliest days of FreightWaves, to get media presence, we went out and talked to a lot of PR agents to sort of cover the story of FreightWaves, or at the time was our futures market and our data products. And we kept getting turned down. And I came across this one publicist that said they would take us on for $40,000 a month. And you're like, that's a lot of money. That's like $500,000 a year. Like, I'm not paying that. And I think he priced it that way. The guy priced it because he didn't want to say no. So it's sort of like in freight brokerage, a load that you don't want, you price really expensively and hope that the customer doesn't take it. But if they do take it, you're like, okay, I'm happy to deliver it. But we ended up finding this person and we balked at it. And they said, look, you should do your own press. Topic's really difficult and you should write your own content. And so we put out an ad, and Brian Strait, that worked at Flea Noter magazine, applied for the job, and he came on. And we said, look, we just want you to write about the market. We want you to write about the things going on in freight. And that was pretty much how we started.
When was this?
In 2017. It would have been March of 2017 when we wrote our first articles, and it was going well. And then Brian Strait went on vacation right during the hurricane that hit Houston. If you remember those hurricane,
I remember that.
I can't remember. I can't remember what the name
was.
It.
No,
say Ivy, but I don't know if it's It's not Ivy. Eileen or something. I can't remember.
Yeah, I remember it. Though.
Sorry if you live in Houston.
Budweiser water loads afterwards that we made a lot of money on.
Yeah, right. So anyways, he had gone on vacation, and I had ran FEMA's disaster logistics for US Express when I worked for the family business 20 years ago. And I just had experience understanding how hurricanes, because in these days, this is the very earliest days when the government started using private contractors to do disaster relief. Before that, it was all done by the military and FEMA. And at this point, they sort of outsourced all that. So we were the very first sort of participants in the market for hurricane relief. And I had been on the ground of these disaster programs where you have hundreds of trucks on the ground, and we ran logistics physically in the market. And so I wrote an op-ed on FreightWaves under Brian Strait's name about the hurricane, and it just blew up the site, and hundreds of thousands of views. And it was just massive. And I think I wrote 2 or 3 more articles in the same sort of response. I'd never considered myself a good writer. I mean, I'd always gotten like C's in English and never knew how to write. And as I started, and he came back from vacation, he was really angry that I used his name. Like, it was like a thing. Like, this isn't my articles. And then I started writing basically with no name. And I found that the stuff that I was writing was really resonating with the audience. And I realized, okay, there is a desire for news and information written from someone who has been sort of on the ground and sort of understands both the macro sort of picture of freight and how it works into the economy, but also sort of the micro. Like, okay, take this concept of what this war or what this hurricane or what COVID means and put it in a way that I, as a freight person, whether I'm a broker or a driver, can understand how that's going to impact my business. And I realized that didn't exist really. Like, if you look at the traditional publications in freight media, and they do a good job for what they're good at. Like, Transport Topics is a really good, if you're concerned about what's happening in Washington around public policy, they do a really good job of covering it. And they'll always do a better job than we will, because they're a lobbyist organization and they talk to members of Congress. But when it comes to market information of like what is happening right now, that simply just didn't exist before we arrived. And because of it is particularly the freight brokers, not the drivers and not the carriers and not the shippers, the freight brokers really didn't have information about what was happening. They were largely left out of the topic. And over the last 20 years, freight brokerage has become a massively big industry. And yet no one was really speaking at it from the idea that this is a market and price is changing. There's a lot of things impacting it. And that was where we realized it was a huge opportunity. And that's how FreightWaves really, really got going. And we realized, okay, we're on to something here.
So this was in 2017, like probably towards the end of 2017, September, October.
Yeah, end of 2017. And I wrote a couple others about the market. So it was right when we had come through a freight recession that started in 2015. And then 2016 was really soft. And then the end of 17, the market was really, the hurricane sort of ignited the freight market. Okay. And we started talking about this recovery and rates shooting up. And people were like, oh yes, thank you. We're out of the woods. And it did well. And, that was sort of, we went on our way. And over time we added more journalists and became a real thing for us. I think the biggest breakout story, there was a couple of stories that really were meaningful in our history. And I think one of them was where we uncovered Amazon's brokerage business, and it shocked the market. Like the entire stock market sold off, or freight market sold off like 9%. What's that?
Well, why was it shocked? I haven't read the article.
Because it was talking about Amazon's brokerage business pricing something like 15 to 20% less than like DAT's rates or something. Okay. And it was just like, people were like, oh my God, like they're going to take off the market. That was like the first time I realized that people that matter, that trade, Wall Street traders really are reading our content. Yeah. And I think but the biggest moment where we started to really think about television or FreightWaves TV and podcasts and really that this is more than just like information, but it actually serves a public utility, was the Celadon bankruptcy. Is you had all of these drivers that were over the road that were stranded, and the company had shut down, but they were not telling anybody. Like management's not responding to calls, and these drivers are literally stranded. And we became, because we got sort of aware of the story early on, we became the source of information for the drivers that were in many ways stranded. And some of them were quite desperate. They didn't know what. You're on the road and you're 2,000 miles away from home and your fuel cards aren't working. What do you do? And so we provided that information. And I think that was a big defining moment for us. And then you've had COVID and you've had all the bankruptcies that happened in 19. And then you had everything that happened between then. So it's just been an evolution of sort of things that have happened in supply chain and freight since we've been around. And we get the opportunity to be a part of those stories and tell those stories.
Definitely. It's super fascinating and it's interesting to hear. And I'm wondering, Craig, what is more profitable, Sonar or FreightWaves?
Well, the media, so if you look at a revenue basis, it's about half and half. I mean, and that seems too convenient, but it's actually the case, is they're growing at about, like, some months the Sonar business will grow faster, and then other months the media business will grow faster. Sonar is a bit more consistent. Like it's SaaS. So subscriptions, you add a certain number of subscriptions, you have a little bit of churn, but consistently you're adding 25 to 30 new customers a month, and almost like clockwork. Sometimes those customers are bigger, sometimes they're a little smaller, but that tends to be the sort of the pace that we go in. Whereas the media business is a little different. It's a little bit more chunky. In other words, you may have one month where you grow and your business goes 70%, and then the next month it's 30% lower than it was the month before. And so it's always growing on a year-over-year basis. It's doubling, and so is Sonar. They're growing at the same pace. In terms of profitability, depends on how you define profitability. If you looked at it from a margin basis, Sonar has higher margins than the media business. It takes a lot in media to create content. You know this, and it's a lot of people and a lot of resources, and you have to feed the beast. I mean, the problem with media is, if you stop writing or you stop producing a video or a podcast, your media business will die. Whereas SaaS is a little different, because once it's built and once the data is flowing into the system, we don't do that, but you could basically stop working on it for months and it wouldn't die. It would still grow. It wouldn't grow as fast and you would have some problems, but the great thing about SaaS subscriptions is it just continues to grow at the steady pace. So because of that, you end up spending a lot more money on as you grow. You have to spend more money to add to your media business, where in SaaS you don't.
Yeah, that's very true with the content. It's not easy always to come up with content.
You got to feed the beast, and I think it's I respect what you're doing at Freight Caviar, because it's interesting, because like at first it's really sort of exciting. You're like, oh, I want to see what you get out there. After a while, it gets just it's like anything else. You're like, okay, but you have to do it. That cadence becomes really important, because if you don't, you'll lose your audience.
And I always try to think of like things that would be interesting. So like in November, I flew to Armenia to meet like double brokers, and I got in trouble and I got all my content deleted, and it was a wild story. But I did that because I have over 1,000 followers that follow me that are double brokers from Armenia. And I'm like, I know that FreightWaves had wrote extensively about it with the investigative reporter. I forgot her name, but
Clarissa.
Yeah, and it's, for me, like, it's an interesting subject. And like now, like, just because I'm in Eastern Europe, I'm like, I'm gonna go visit Boris in Macedonia. I'm gonna film it. I'm trying to get more comfortable in front of the camera, and I feel like the more at bats I have, the better I'm doing. And it's just maybe one day I'll be better at it, especially like when I'm traveling or showing like a city. So that's what I'm trying to do. It's now.
It's just practice, and then looking at data, and just like in the earliest days, and I still do this some, not everything I do, but in the earliest days, I watched every video over and over after I did it. Even if it's like a TV interview or like a podcast, I would watch it and find ways that I could improve. I don't do that as much anymore, but in the earliest days, that's what you do, because you want it. My wife would think it was narcissism because you're like staring at it, but it's how you're going to hone your craft. And you're a public speaker, you're a public presence, you're putting out videos. You want to continue to be better at that. And the same thing for me is I wanted to continue to be better at it. And there's a point though, you get to you just have certain idiosyncrasies you're always going to have. And you get you get sort of the basics down, and it just becomes diminishing returns. So
yeah. And it's always about like trying to figure out something that's exciting, something that's like kind of like different that the audience could like. I mean, I posted this rap video of a dispatch or of a trucker.
I saw that. My brother sent it to me. It's awesome.
It's so funny. Like, I mean, it's actually a good rap song. And
it's a good rap song. And what he says is what every driver thinks about, right? Like, my dispatcher's a liar. Like I don't know the exact words, but like, it was awesome. It was
Where's
fun.
My detention? You said you got me, but you don't. Yeah, it's super fun. It's
where's great. My detention? Yeah. It was well produced. So
so I put that out. That went very well on Instagram. And there's like 40,000 views on Instagram and over 2,000 likes. I'm like, it's nice. Like for me, like now with my audience, it's like I don't have to necessarily make my own content. I have to find good content and just put it out there, and then tag the person. Always make sure to tag the person that created the content, because I think that's the fair and honest thing to do. And it's like, as long as I'm a source of good content, that's all it really is, right? It's like being a source of good content.
And the thing is, like, it's not a zero-sum game. And so I remember when I'd seen some of your work, and then there was a moment where you like called us out, and you're like, I'm bigger than FreightWaves. And I was like, that's awesome. Like because as a founder, and the company's 5 years old. We're still in the earliest sort of innings of our business. We're not, it's still a founder-driven company. It's largely a managed-driven company today, but I'm still very active in the business. And I remember what it was like in those earliest days. And I remember going out and posting, rankings of top, the rankings of where like Transport Topics and the Journal of Commerce. And I put those out, and I remember thinking, oh my God, it's going to offend all these people. And I think it largely did. But what it did was it raised our profile. And I was like, okay, I see what he's doing. Like, that's awesome. Like, if you're going to beat us, do it. The content's got to be good. And I loved it. I thought it was a founder to founder. I respect it. Like, that's cool.
That's awesome. I appreciate that. And it's what's interesting is that like we're also like doing like completely different content, right? Mine is more like humor and kind of stupid. Like, and the funny thing is, when I was like actually like developing Breakout or like building it up, I think most people, especially my old bosses, probably thought like, Paul, what is wrong with you? Like, are you okay? Like, do you like, is everything okay? Like mentally kind of thing? Like, just because they're like you went from having like such a good job to making memes on Freight. And it's like, like, and it's funny, but it's somehow
but like
worked out.
we have to laugh. Like this industry is so like stressful, and there's so many things that are wrong with the industry that if we're not making fun of ourselves, then what are we doing? And it's funny because, you go back to like the Ever Given, the ship that shut off the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
And, we were reposting because we don't develop a lot of memes at FreightWaves. It's just not the style of media. It's certainly your style, and you do a really good job of it. We're just not that funny. And the reality is like we were loving all the memes about the canal getting shut down and what all that meant. And one of the other media businesses, the Journal of Commerce, they would never make fun of it. And it's like, guys, and they were offended we were making fun of like this ship. It's like, what else are we supposed to laugh about? Like, this is a serious industry with a lot of stress. You have to sort of have fun about it and enjoy it, because otherwise, what are you doing? So
totally. Yeah.
You can't take yourself too serious.
Yeah. And now you have a new venture, Back the Truck Up. And could you tell us, Craig, how that came about and what your goals are with Back the Truck
So
Up?
I bought Flying Magazine. I'm a pilot. And Flying Magazine is a passion project, and it's mostly direct to consumer. And what I mean by that is Flying writes for the pilot. And if you look at FreightWaves content, we're not really doing a lot of content for the driver themselves, for the owner operator. The areas that we're least represented in terms of our audience or in content happens to be driver recruiting and equipment is trucks. And there are media organizations, frankly, do a better job of covering equipment and covering recruiting than we do. And we thought, well, we're writing FreightWaves content is in many ways very serious content. It's not, I think Dooner lightens it up with What the Truck with some meme worthy. We're still talking about, things that are more executive level content. And we wanted something that was a little lighthearted in order to reach the driver population and to create more fun. So we're creating Back the Truck Up as sort of an irrelevant or irreverent version of FreightWaves that sort of pokes fun at it and brings a little bit of lightheartedness into it. So that's really what the concept between Back the Truck Up is.
Very cool. And then what about Flying Magazine? So you bought a magazine, which is congrats, by the way. That's awesome.
It was the magazine. It was the magazine I grew. It's like a traditional magazine.
That's a beautiful cover too. I like the logo. I like
this is I grew up reading this magazine. It's probably, I always use Sports Illustrated as an example, because I think anyone that was into sports grew up at least my age, sort of Michael Jordan being on the front of Sports Illustrated or Tiger Woods. And for me, Flying Magazine was like the Sports Illustrated. And I grew up reading it. And as a pilot, and I had taken 20 years off of flying, I got back into it the past year, started reading it and realized, there's a lot of things, putting my media hat, that I could do for flying that would just make it for the next generation, more digital focused, something that I could be proud of as a pilot. And I reached out to the owner and said, hey, can I buy it? And he's like, it's not for sale, but we ended up working a deal anyways. And I now have I made my 6-year-old self really proud, because I've now taken the magazine that I grew up reading and it's my magazine, or a magazine that I get the chance to run. And it's interesting because it's got a lot of media is very similar in many ways. So a lot of the playbook that I learned from FreightWaves, I get to apply to flying. But there's oftentimes that through flying, I learn things that I can then go apply to FreightWaves. Like literally when we talk about reaching the driver, FreightWaves doesn't reach the drivers that deeply in their day-to-day, and flying reaches the pilots very deep day-to-day. We should be able to pull that off at FreightWaves. And so that's some of the sort of thinking about how to transfer the two audiences is there. But flying's a print magazine, and print is a very difficult business. And it's been a fun. I mean, as a founder, businesses at some point, like everything, gets a little boring when, you've sort of built it, and you're always looking for some type of side project to sort of get into. And flying was that for me, and it is that for me in some ways.
Sure. That's awesome. It's exciting. Craig, what does your day-to-day look like? So now you're the CEO of FreightWaves and Sonar, CEO, the owner of Flying Magazine.
Sonar is part of FreightWaves. So it all reports to FreightWaves. FreightWaves is the media business, and then Sonar is the data business, but they're effectively the same business.
Yeah. And then you're also the owner of Flying. So what does your day-to-day look like? What time do you start work? What are you working on throughout the day, and what time do you end?
I mean, I wake up most days around 7, depends on the kid situation. I have 5 kids. So some days it can be, some days awesome. I'm up at 6, and other days I get to sleep into 7:15. So really get up about 7, and I immediately turn on the news. Usually CNBC, sort of my morning show. My wife gets up earlier to feed we have twins, so she gets up about 6:30 to feed the twins. So she's usually out of the room, and usually I start with CNBC or Bloomberg, and I answer. I read my emails, and then go through my Twitter feed, and that's my day to start. And I usually don't schedule meetings in the morning. I just don't like to do that. I like to start the day about 11 a.m. So the first couple hours is just time for me to sort of catch up from projects that I held off. And then the rest of the day, that sort of starts my day. So a lot of times it's calls and meetings and discussions, and that ends, say, about 3, because I try not to take a lot of meetings. I find meetings mostly time sucks. And sure. After that, then I end up doing the work that I want to do. And I end my day usually, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. Okay. So, I mean, I'm running FreightWaves, I'm running Flying. FreightWaves, for the most part, could run without me. And it's a little hard to say as your ego, because your ego there. But I've tried to bring a management team in that could run the business without me. And I think in some ways they prefer to run the business without me, because they get to do what they want to do without having my interference. And so in many ways, I'm become the advocate for what we do at FreightWaves. I'm still involved in a lot of the key strategic decisions as setting the strategic direction of the business. But the most of what you see as a consumer of our content or consumer of our data, that is being done mostly, if not all, by the team. And then occasionally, when the market has these big developments or these big stories, that's when I sort of re-engage with the content. We've seen that happen where the freight market is getting, the volatility has gone from way up to, the market seems to be slowing down. And because it seemed to be slowing down, there's a lot to talk about. You go back 6 months ago, like even our own data, I wasn't looking at our own data for weeks at a time, because frankly, it was all positive if you're a trucking company. Yeah. Where it starts to look like it's getting unstable, that's when I'm starting to consume. That's when I'm starting to read and really try to understand what's happening.
So what are your predictions, Craig? Because I know I've seen that the market is drying up right now. And what are your predictions? What does Sonar think in terms of what the next few quarters will look like?
I think it's going to be pretty ugly. I mean, I think the market is slowing down aggressively. I think we're seeing the fuel prices really sap a lot of the drivers' income, and it's sapping consumer spending. And it's a time when the economy has been largely, for the last 2 years, physical goods, which is freight, have been in high demand and record demand. And every dollar was focused on that. And what we've seen now is a shift to spending is now moving towards services and experiences. And because of all of the things that are happening, it's slowing the amount of money that's spent on physical goods. And that is really, really hurting the freight market at a time when you've had so many new trucks enter the market, new carriers enter the market, and they've entered at the top of the market. They went out and bought very expensive trucks just because they were priced higher. And they may have paid the drivers more just to attract them than they would otherwise earn. And they're going to have to deal with the fact that the market is now oversupplied with too much capacity and not enough freight. at a time when their costs are much higher. So I think it's going to be pretty ugly for part of the market, particularly the spot market, over the next couple of quarters. And it concerns me because I think we'll see a lot of companies that won't survive.
Okay. And that's in terms of trucking companies, I'm guessing, right? Like freight brokers.
Yeah, trucking companies. Yep.
Yeah. It's a little bit easier. Okay.
I mean, for brokers, the good news is short-term margin expansion is a reality. Like if you've got contract rates, you will benefit from expanding margins because your rates are going to stay high. Contract rates will stay high for some period of time, and you'll be able to buy trucks far cheaper than you were, say, a month ago or 6 months ago.
Sure.
And so you'll see expansion, but you'll see less volume. And so the volume is certainly going to dry up. The margins you'll make will be higher, but it's going to be a rough market. Drivers are going to want to be finding freight that can keep them moving. And so it's going to be an interesting time.
Yeah, definitely. Craig, I want to bring this up because I saw you write, I don't know, half a year ago, maybe a little bit longer, like on LinkedIn about DAT and why you didn't cover DAT. I'm not sure, like there's some competition between Sonar and DAT. So like, I was actually wondering, so I know like DAT obviously gathers rates. They do the gathering rates and they sell that. I'm wondering, since Sonar isn't a load board, what is like, where are you really competing at with DAT, and why don't you want to cover them?
Well, I think the reality is that, DAT gets their rates from, they call assessments. So it's not coming from their load board business. They get reports from brokers that submit those rates. And we have a product, Sonar, that is providing market intelligence. Rates is one of those elements. We gather our data quite different than what DAT does. We believe, this is our belief, that our methodology is superior. And I don't want to go too deep because I want to, the reality is, as a media business, is we have an enormous amount of responsibility to educate and inform the broader audience that's in logistics about what's happening. But there's also a competitive element to FreightWaves and DAT, and it's on their side. They write a lot more. They write constantly and talk about their competition. They're referring to us clearly when they do that. And I think for us, we have a responsibility to understand how what we publish and what we talk about, whether or not that is providing a service to the user. It would be disingenuous for us to write things about our largest competitor and try, because the reality is no media, and I don't care whether we're talking NPR, PBS, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, Freight Caviar, FreightWaves, whatever it is, no media is entirely short of bias. The idea that any media doesn't have bias is just completely wrong. It is unfair for us to write commentary and cover stories that involves our number one competition and give them a fair look and give the audience a fair representation of what's happening. And I think because of that responsibility, there's times when they post press releases and stories that are positive about their product releases, or there's times that there are stories where they have challenges, and those would be opportunities where we certainly could pounce, if you will, on stories. I think as a policy, it is cleaner for us to stay away from that. And so there was this controversy where they did a press release with C.H. Robinson, and I can't remember the context of it. I just remember it had C.H. Robinson and DAT. And, we had strong opinions about what that would mean for the market. There's certainly a temptation to write those, but we stayed away from that. And we thought that was the right thing to do because we had views that were different than what, but we of course have bias to that. We're naturally going to look at things a little differently. And because of that bias, we decided not to cover it at all. We certainly don't write press releases, just republishing press releases. We might write positive commentary when company has releases. We're certainly going to cover the story. And most of the time when the releases, they tend to be positive, but we didn't feel like we owed anything on the good or bad. And there has been a history where when we've written stuff, even inconsequential things, about DAT that they felt like it was unfair to them. So we decided that as a policy to stay completely out of that. And so there were people on social media commenting, well, FreightWaves isn't covering it. And, they're being unfair, unjust by not covering this press release. Well, first of all, we're not a public utility. We're a business. And as a business, we obviously have products, and it's like going on Fox. Fox is not going to cover press releases of CNN, and it's just not the way it works. And so we don't have an obligation to do that. But rather than letting this controversy sort of fester in the industry and people say, well, the reason you're not covering it is because you have this bias. And the reality is it's just better to have a policy. We're not going to cover anything. And so as a policy, we don't cover DAT. And whether they have good news or things that are that are as bad news or as issues in their business, we're not going to cover it. Now, if it was a story that was sort of massive and it became something that you just couldn't not cover it, certainly we would. But in a situation where these are, within sort of traditional business realms, we're just, as a policy, we're not covering DAT. And people can get plenty of information about DAT from either their own coverage in their own blog or through third-party media outlets, which are happy to cover them. So that is what that was all about. A lot of people were trying to comment and box me into this sort of argument. And I'm just like, look, I'm going to make it very clear. We're simply not covering it. And I don't think we owe anything more than that. That's the reality. And that is why you won't see DAT coverage on our website. We're obviously, what's that?
I was going to say, I should cover the DAT FreightWaves kind of beef. I think it's a good free to have your content.
I mean, you are certainly welcome to do it. I think you'll find that I can't say that, but I think both of us sort of have this detente of like, let's keep it civil for the rest of the market. I mean, look, at the end of the day, DAT does a good job. Their load board is renowned. We have a lot of respect for the team and the products that they put out. And but like any competitor, we have strong opinions of where there are opportunities for our products to be more advanced and our products to be positioned in a way that theirs aren't. So with that said, I think it is real that there is a legitimate competitive rivalry, and I think it's on both sides. And we've just chosen as an editorial publication to stay out of trying to cover a story that we have a lot of opinions and I just don't think it's fair.
Yeah, no, I definitely understand that. And I've had someone tell me that I should be like the TMZ of freight with Freight Caviar, and I could definitely highlight some of these stories. And
as a disinterested party, there is the opportunity to cover stories that other outlets for whatever reason won't pick up. But that's our policy. And I think that's, that we're very public about that. I think we wanted to get ahead of the controversy. We hadn't been covering those stories for a while. And the reason I made the statement was I just wanted to kill any of the noise about it, because it was ungrounded really.
Sure. I understand that. Craig, what kind of tips, this to start wrapping up, I guess, what kind of tips would you give to a recent college grad? And what kind of tips would you give to me?
Well, I think network. So one of the things I underappreciated in college is networking is everything, right? At the end of the day, whether you're talking about in college or, whether it's joining a fraternity or a sorority or joining an organization, connecting with alumni, networking is everything in life. And it's not what you know, it's frankly who you know. And that is it's the way human nature works. Whether we like it or not, civilization is built so that we trust people that are in our network that can help make our lives better, make introductions, help us find jobs, help us find spouses and partners and business opportunities. And So, and having a really strong network is really important. And I think as a college kid, I would be spending less time in the classroom and more time at the bar. Not, I don't drink, so I did when I was in college, but not because I'm condoning it, but spend more time in activities and networking than spending time learning. Because a lot of the content just goes away. It isn't important.
Yeah.
But what is important is those relationships that can help you advance your career, or help make introductions to people that can.
Totally.
As it relates to you, like, I think you're doing the right thing. I mean, Freight Caviar has built a really nice brand so far. It's still early in the journey. And if you become the TMZ of trucking,
I don't want to be the TMZ of trucking, but maybe something classier than TMZ.
What's that?
Maybe something classier, a little bit classier than TMZ. I don't want to.
Was it like people? I guess people is a little like up market, right? Or 2020 is sort of up market. It's a little serious.
I don't watch those, so I don't even know.
Okay, but look, I think if anything that makes content development successful, it's cadence, and cadence is really important to keep the journey alive. And I think at some point, in order to keep your audience, you have to continue to produce content. And I think you're going to make a choice. What does that look like in terms of how do you keep it going for 6 months, for a year, 2 years? And so finding some people that can support you, whether it's you hire them or whether they're a part of some, whether they can support you in some way, is going to be important, because putting out content every day is exhausting. And I've seen so many people burn out. I've seen so many independent folks burn out, and the burnout is real. The best way to avoid burnout is to share some of the load of the work. Because a lot of it's just doing, like, there's something awesome about having a piece of content goes viral, and it's a huge dopamine surge. Yeah. The challenge is most of the content, no matter what you produce, doesn't go viral. And
for sure.
So you have to sort of like deal with that, and that becomes discouraging. But it is also exhausting. It's like, and so just staying in the game, not burning yourself out, and having support is going to be really important.
Definitely. I got a videographer, and I got a girl that's like kind of like my assistant so far. So
just keeping it going, keep the content coming, because that's what the audience wants. And I think if you do that, you can build a really distinct brand.
Yeah, that's definitely the goal. Well, Craig, thank you so much for your time. I'm gonna wrap it up here in terms of recording. Any last words?
No, like I mean, it's such an interesting time in our industry, and I've said this plenty of times, is that we now, if you think about over the last 5 years and 10 years, is we now have the ability to connect with people that work beyond our own companies. We now have the ability to have real-time information. We now have the ability to sort of laugh and have fun and make fun of the things that we don't like about this industry. And I think that's a pretty powerful opportunity. And what you're doing at Freight Caviar, what we're doing at FreightWaves, and what others are putting out in terms of content, that rap video is awesome. Because like that's what our industry is all about. It's a subculture. And I think as long as you have passion in what you produce, it's gonna work out really well. And so really honored to be here and excited about the journey that you're on, because it reminds me much about our earliest journeys. Hopefully in 5 years, we'll look back and you'll build this massively successful, not TMZ media business. TMZ. And we'll all remark about how the earliest days were pretty fun.
Definitely. Well, Craig, once again, thank you.